My name is Rahul Himrajani, and I am an assistant professor of law here at the National Law School of India University, where I'm also the faculty director for the JSW Centre for the Future of Law. The JSW Centre is a center funded by the JSW Foundation, and it started its activities in 2024. And the objectives of the center are to expand academic learning and research on issues relating to law, technology, and system reform. And through partnerships across academia, governments, regulators, civil society, and industry, the center aims to promote a robust and interdisciplinary understanding of issues such as the interface between health and regulation, the environment and the law, risk and corporate regulation, and the impact of new technologies on the future of law. As might be evident, we are extremely interested in topics of artificial intelligence and the law. And as many of you know, we have a flagship summit. The government is organizing a flagship summit called the India AI Impact Summit in February. And as a lead up to the Impact Summit, the JSW Centre has organized several pre-summit events, starting from our AI and Everyday Life workshop on the 10th of this month. We had Dr. Akash Kapoor, who had his keynote talk on last Saturday, on the 17th, where he talked about DPIs and how the idea of DPIs and AI interact. Specifically, he sort of talked about how the DPI system can be benefited from the new from the leverage that AI provides it, and how AI itself can be used as a digital public good. And today we have this panel discussion, which is on AI governance and the Global South. We're joined by several eminent panelists. I'm going to introduce all of them briefly. We have Amlan Mohanty, who is a non-resident fellow at NITI Aayog and fellow at Carnegie India. He is a seasoned technology lawyer and policy advisor, and he previously worked at public policy and government affairs for Google for India. He's also an alumnus of NLS. So welcome, Amlan. We have Yunus, who is going to join us online. Yunus is the head of AI and emerging tech policy at Asia Pacific at Google. She's a former diplomat and trade negotiator for the Singapore government, and she now leads Google's policy engagement on artificial intelligence and emerging technologies across the APAC region. We have Prakash Narayan, who is the Global General Counsel at L&T Technology Services. He brings extensive experience in corporate legal strategy and compliance across technology and engineering sectors. Prior to LTTS, he held senior leadership roles at IBM and Bombardier. We also have Jaideep Reddy, who is a partner at the Trilegal's Technology, Media, and Telecom practice. He is a specialist in disruptive technologies and their implications. His practice covers fintech, artificial intelligence, e-commerce, and data protection. We have Professor Rahul Dey, who is now an independent consultant and researcher, but he used to be a professor at information systems at IIM Bangalore. He's a distinguished academic with over 3 decades of experience in teaching and research on AI ethics, digital transformation, open source systems, and e-government. And we have Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy, who is the Vice Chancellor of NLSIU, who has worked extensively in the area of technology, law, and regulation. So thank you to all of our panelists for coming here. And this panel discussion is going to be on AI governance in the Global South. We plan to center the discussion around the newly published India AI governance guidelines. In particular, we are interested in examining questions such as what distinctive challenges does the Global South face in relation to AI governance, which issues constitute the primary concerns of countries in the Global South, and how can an original and context-sensitive governance framework be developed to the specific needs of the Global South, right? And India, the India AI governance guidelines tries and answers these questions in a particular way. So to start off, I'll invite Amlan, who is the lead writer for the governance guidelines, to make a statement. The format we'll follow is we'll give each speaker around 10 minutes to make opening statements, and then we'll open up the discussion to the wider public. So Amlan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rahul. It's a real pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. Maybe good afternoon to Yunus in Singapore. But Always a pleasure to be back to my alma mater. I owe a debt of gratitude to National Law School. So when I was invited for this, it's been a lot of travel, crazy travel week, month, but I just really wanted to be here. So thank you, Professor Sudhir. Thanks, Siddharth, for organizing this, having me here. 10 minutes is very generous. So I don't know that I can, sustain these interest of everyone here in this room and online for 10 minutes. So I'll see kind of where we'll go with this, but I want to do maybe three things. One is because I have the benefit of going first, I'll try and, actually raise some questions, some framing questions around the topic of this discussion, right? And I see three key words here. AI, governance, and global south. And I'll just break this down, tease it out, and really try and get people thinking about this because I'm here also just to hear different perspectives. So first, I'll just try and do some framing around these three terms. Second is I'll kind of provide my sense of what the approach to the AI governance guidelines, the India AI governance guidelines was. Obviously, shared anything that you're interested in from an insider's view, but try and kind of make a case for why this makes sense for India. I'll do that in the second order. And the third piece is really think about the global south context, right? Which is, okay, so India's put something out. We're hosting this summit in Feb next month. Why does this matter for the global south? And what am I seeing from some of my research and engagements in the region? And then, of course, I'd love to hear from the other panelists. So maybe just some framing questions, right? And like I said, I'll try and break down AI governance and global south, and it's just really me asking more questions based on from my vantage point. So I'll start with AI, right? Why does it matter right now? And just to put, be very clear, for me, the stakes are very high when it comes to AI right now. I taught a course here a few months ago, and I always start by saying AI is not new, right? As much as you might be hearing all of the hype around AI over the last 2-3 years since ChatGPT was launched, 2023, it's been around since the 1950s. So really the question to ask is, why are the stakes particularly high right now? Or what do they seem to be particularly high right now? And I think it's just really some massive technical breakthroughs over the last 2 or 3 years that have fundamentally changed how I at least perceive this technology, right? And I've been obviously tracking this for several years. I used to work at Google before this as well. So I had a ringside view from the early 2010s. I think it's fundamentally this idea that they're able to understand natural language. I think that's fantastic and impressive, but we should talk about obviously the challenges when it comes to language accessibility, inclusivity for the global south. But I think natural language understanding is huge. I think the ability to generate tokens and predict words, I think, is from the context of being able to generate useful text or video or audio is huge, right? So this is the whole revolution on generative AI. But going forward, increasingly this idea that they are highly autonomous, access to, large swaths of data that they, I think, understand in a more abstract conceptual way and able to perform actions in the real world, whether that's digital or physical. And people call this, agentic AI or agentic systems, and that's really the future. So I think all of this coming together, my view over the next 3 to 5 years is we are going to have highly capable systems that are able to perform actions on par with or as close to human cognitive abilities, and in some case perhaps exceeding human capabilities as well. And I just wanted to lay that out for why I think the stakes are so high when it comes to the governance question, right? Two, let me just kind of think about the global south question for a bit, right? Which is where we are geopolitically, right? So anyone who's tracked anything, at Davos most recently, but just what's been happening over the last, couple of years is complete like transformation or a rupture, depending on how you want to see it in the global order, right? And when it comes to how countries are building strategic advantages, it's almost entirely about technology. I am in many bilateral conversations, many multilateral conversations. The first order of business is always technology, and increasingly around AI, right? We want to build strategic advantages around, your ability to develop frontier technologies that will then allow you a leapfrog advantage in areas like defense or space or biology, automation, automotive industries, and so on, energy, and so on. Right? So it's really a foundational generous general purpose technologies that gives you stronger geopolitical advantage. So, I just wanted to frame the AI governance debate in the context of what's happening geopolitically. My sense is that we're increasingly going to be in a bipolar world when it comes to AI. It's US and China really, leading the race here. And then there's everybody else. And so it's worth when it comes to the AI race. But it's also worth asking, geopolitically in the world order, is that also the world that we're leading to? And so, when you ask, about AI governance in the global south, I would kind of retort with what do we mean by the global south, right? Is it just, you're actually looking at a world map and seeing everything below the equator? No, that's obviously not the case. Are you talking about another term that's being thrown around, right? Middle powers. Anybody who heard Prime Minister Carney at Davos will say, wait, he's talking about Canada as a middle power. So what's happening there, right? And then I would ask you, China, right? Potentially global south, has a lot of the characteristics of the global south, but technologically really advanced. So are we talking about China as well? So I just wanted to, present this kind of view of how geopolitically this question of AI governance in the global south has no easy answers. And so I'd love to kind of hear other perspectives on that. And then finally, on this question of governance itself, right? And we're talking about the AI governance guidelines. And Professor Sudhir and I were just chatting about before this, and you said, okay, this is title of this report is AI governance guidelines. So what do we mean by governance? Is it saying true to form? And actually, I should just say that this was actually the first order of business in the committee, which is what do we mean by governance? And I think obviously in a room like this, where many of us are trained as lawyers, very comfortable using a kind of lens of rights and obligations when it comes to governance. I think, we agreed in that committee, there seemed to be consensus that we need to think beyond that. And I'm actually increasingly comfortable with this idea that governance is not just about regulation or risk mitigation when it comes to AI. It's actually a lot more, and I'll talk about this in terms of our approach on the guidelines. It's as much about awareness and capacity building and institution building and adoption and diffusion and so on. So that's the broader view of governance that I'm increasingly getting comfortable with. But let me be very clear, I still think obviously risk, mitigation, regulation through rights and obligations still very important, right? And I might be the minority, at least in the global south view, but that's still my view. But it's both, not either. Great, so that's part one. I hope I've kind of raised some questions. Would love to kind of hear the panelists respond to some of this. Let's talk about India, right, and the governance guidelines. Just maybe 10 seconds of context. Prime Minister asked the principal scientific advisor to essentially create India's governance framework. He set up this committee where it was just a group of about 10 experts from government and academia who kind of framed this framework, and I was asked to be the lead writer here. I think many different ways I can talk about the process, the experience, but the substance of it, of course. But I'll maybe make 3 points, right? The first is, as I said earlier, right? The mandate was here to create a governance framework for India when it comes to artificial intelligence. And the natural inclination was to look at what's happening around the world. But we took a step back and said, like, first principles, what do we mean by governance? And we immediately decided we didn't want to create a regulatory framework. We had the EU experience to learn from and said, there seems to be this rush to regulate in some parts of the world. And there are certainly some risks. But can we think about this governance framework as more of a strategy document almost, right? And of course, there's different versions of a national AI strategy in India. There's the NITI AI strategy. There's the METI AI mission that has a strategy. But can we think about this governance framework as a form of a strategy document itself? So the first piece was to say, we're not talking about just regulation. It's a governance framework and an expansive view of governance at that. We need to think about adoption, diffusion, capacity building for public sector officials, for the common person, for people building startups in India. So that's the kind of lens through which we're thinking about the AI governance framework. So that's point number one. Point number two is, as I said, we had a lot of different kind of models that we could choose from, and I was talking about geopolitically how different countries are approaching this. At a very high level, I see it as 3 distinct approaches we could have taken. The free market laissez-faire approach that is basically the US approach, and I say they went from low regulation to no regulation right now, or if there's anti-regulation on the spectrum, that's where they're at. On the other spectrum is a very norms-based, rights-based prescriptive approach, and everyone points to the EU for this. But by the way, there are a lot of other countries that are doing this, right? China is also very prescriptive and rules-based when it comes to AI, right? They have specific rules on generative AI, on content authentication, labeling, deepfakes, and so on. South Korea just passed a law, which is again very rules-based and prescriptive. So there's another set of models to choose from. And then there's other countries that are kind of straddling the middle. And so, we were very intentional to say, let's just not even look at that framework. Let's just work bottom up from what India's needs are. And we fortunately had a very clear strategic goal from the Prime Minister's office, which is we want to use AI for inclusive development. That's it. That's the goal. Economic growth, productivity, social impact. We don't care about building new technologies for the sake of it, for technology bragging rights, as I call it. It's a very specific governance framework aimed at promoting development. And so we had to kind of work through what that meant. But really the point I want to make, the second point, is this is built for India from the ground up, keeping India's strategic goals in mind. And so, the regulatory framework is about, let's not create new regulations. We have a complex adaptive system of the constitutional rights to statutory frameworks to executive rule making to lots of discretionary power at the local kind of panchayat level. Can we leverage that to say let's apply existing laws to AI as opposed to creating a separate AI law, right? And then for specific issues that matter to India, whether it's bias, or women and children safety, or deep fakes, we'll do targeted amendments. So we just kind of built around that idea of let's look at what India has, what India needs, and then build a framework around that. And then the third and final point is, I think very relevant for the Global South, which is, this has to be a living document. This AI governance guidelines is a living document. We'll review it, we'll, adapt it, adopt it, because, state of technology, this is obviously at this point a cliche, but, the technology is always outpacing the regulation. So it needs to be agile, it needs to be flexible, and then you can decide kind of where you want to stand on this innovation versus regulation or safety spectrum. But at least in the report, we've said pro innovation because that again matches kind of national priorities, which is to support the growth of this ecosystem. And so those are kind of three kind of principles that I would say reflect the approach to the India AI guideline. And finally, I just want to end with this piece around what does this matter for the Global South? India is hosting this summit in Feb. The main thrust of this is two things, right? It's about impact. So it's called the AI Impact Summit. So you'll see a lot more focus on really trying to understand whether there is a return on investment on all of these big infrastructure investments we're making, whether there's actual tangible impact on the socioeconomic indices, whether enterprises are adopting this and finding value in it. So that's what this summit is about. And two is to really be inclusive geopolitically, bringing in the Global South. And so this is about bringing the African Union, Latin American countries, Pacific Island states into the fold, giving them a seat at the table and having kind of a point of view, right, when it comes to global AI governance. And so I'm just about to publish this paper maybe in a week or two on AI governance in South Asia. It's 5 countries, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Very understudied, but happy to kind of point out that all of these countries have AI strategies and AI governance strategies as well. And so, we did some research, and I see Akshat here, who's one of my interns, a student here in one of my classes, and we worked on this together. Really interesting kind of insights. And I'll just point out 5 things, right, which shows the commonality on how we're thinking about AI governance in this South Asia region. It's all about applying AI, right, for use cases. It's not about building frontier AI models. So, your use case orientation, as we call it, number 1. 2 is a very pragmatic approach to governance and regulation. It's like we're not going to create an AI law just for the sake of it. We'll see kind of what our needs and promote voluntary commitments and standards and techno-legal approaches and so on, right? Very pragmatic view. 3 is this emphasis on linguistic diversity and equity and inclusivity, right? Really important in each of these countries, Zonka, Sinhalese, Nepalese, you need them reflected in your local models. You can't just import an English large language model to your country, right? So linguistic diversity and access. And 4, this idea of, an aspiration for sovereign AI and sovereign infrastructure, but at the same time, you have this dependence on foreign service providers. So that's, again, a commonality across these regions. And finally, when you're thinking about long-term societal impact, the impact on, human capital and jobs, particularly, right? If there's a large informal workforce, the impact of AI could be particularly significant. So we need to think about governance frameworks that, are able to adapt or transition these labor markets successfully. So I think I may have actually done 10 minutes, so I'll take back what I said, but hopefully that was useful and some good, useful context setting. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That was very useful context setting, Amlan. Let's now go and hear some thoughts from Eunice, who's joined us online. So, Eunice, uh, uh, could you, Rahul, could you
Yeah.
spotlight Eunice, please? Yeah, Eunice, you can go ahead.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. Really sorry I can't be there in person. Would have loved to be there. And Amlan, that was that's a tough act to follow. I don't know how I can beat your 10 minutes of very insightful remarks. But maybe I thought I'd just offer maybe a perspective from industry. So just to give some context, so my work involves me sort of talking to many governments, sort of stakeholders in the Asia Pacific region about AI governance, AI policy, AI regulation. And so, perhaps maybe I can offer a perspective from what I'm seeing and where I'm seeing India really standing out in that regard. Um, so I go around the region a lot, and I think one thing that's clear from a lot of the conversations that I have is that there is broad and wide enthusiasm for AI in the Asia Pacific region. And when you go to Europe, and, sometimes I do travel to Europe or the US, the conversation and the discourse there is extremely different, right? In Bangkok, in Delhi, in Seoul, people are excited about the use cases. There's a lot of innovation. The startups are excited. They're doing all sorts of interesting things, right? You go to these conferences and there are like 1,000 startups experimenting with different AI tools, building different AI agents, even, and that is a completely different conversation and sort of just general mood um, from the West. And this is reflected in some of our survey findings. So every year we do this, beginning of every year, we put out this thing called Our Life with AI. I'm happy to send around the link later. We've been doing this for 3 years, and tracking the same bunch of countries about, asking them questions, how enthusiastic are you about AI? Have you used AI tools? And two key things, right, to just share. The first is, no doubt, emerging markets and Asian countries are far ahead of the curve when it comes to AI optimism, not just AI optimism, but AI adoption. So that's one. The second is that when we've also found that there's some kind of relationship between people who have used AI and their attitudes towards AI. So if you have used AI before, you are likely to be more excited about the potential of the technology than someone who has never used AI and is just sitting in their living room and sort of conjuring up these image of killer robots, right, coming for them. So I think that's very apparent. And so India, where India sits in this, India really has consistently been one of the top countries, most like highest adopters and most optimistic, right? So this year's result showed 69% of the people that we polled in India were excited about AI versus 33% in the US. That's more than half. And so it's very stark if you look at the numbers, right? And I think, if you think about public sentiment and then you translate that into the way that governments then think about AI and how they're approaching this, there is also some kind of correlation, right? So, the way that India has put out a very pro-innovation, balanced, and forward-leaning posture on AI, right, I think reflects that sort of nationwide attitude towards technology. And also, I think India really truly understands how profound and how transformative that this AI shift is going to be for its economy. Like what Amlan said, right? It's going to be an engine of economic growth, and help to untangle a lot of these very, very intractable social issues as well. So I think, from at least from our perspective, we think that the India AI governance guidelines and the seven sutras are very well written, very balanced, very pro innovation, very sensible, and most importantly, I think very uniquely adapted to India. Right, it's very clear that sort of the people who have written it and thought through, the committee that has thought through this process has been very focused on not copying and pasting. Right, yes, you learn from other jurisdictions, you see what the EU is doing, you see what the US doing, but I don't see language that's copied from Article 49 or Article 50 of the EU AI Act, right? It's not that way. It's very, very focused and targeted at helping India move ahead on that. And two, I think is very, very focused, I think, on helping to encourage broad adoption and deployment of AI throughout society. And what we see that is going to be really helpful. Um, so that's that. Two, I think, like completely agree with what Amlan said about governance, right? When we think about governance, the way I think about it is not just hard law. I'm not a lawyer, but it's not just hard law and regulation, right? But I think it's also about standards, right? It's also about supporting AI policy, right? So what does that mean for copyright policy, right? What does that mean in terms of the use of data, in your privacy laws? And then also tooling, right? That's another thing. Do you have tools for people to test and verify, whether their AI apps or their AI codes are up to certain standards, right? Whether it's international standards or it corresponds to certain safety benchmarks. So I think these things are important to look at from an ecosystem level and not just purely in a very strict sort of track on regulation and law. Um, and I think at the end of the day, sort of putting this together really is about enabling adoption and really setting out what good looks like, right? And from there, then encouraging a race to the top, rather than sort of trying to penalize those at the bottom. So that's on the governance side. Then I think two things, a couple of things about the global south based on what I'm seeing across the region, right? A couple of challenges that are quite distinctive to the global south countries. But again, what is the global south, as Amlan pointed out, it's not monolithic. It's all the countries are very, very, very different, right? When I go to Thailand, it's extremely different context from Indonesia or from Vietnam. But the some common threads are, one, I think, lack of general regulatory capacity in the government, right? Like it's very difficult, I think, for them to be able to put in laws and properly enforce them. And I think that is something that is challenging in terms of then how AI is going to be governed, especially if you're going to copy and paste frameworks like the EU AI Act. I often say, are you sure? I do ask some of these officials who draft, AI laws that are pretty much copied from the EU AI Act, right? They said, and I say, are you sure? Because the AI office has to hire hundreds of people just to implement this law. Do you have the same amount of people? And the EU AI Act built on a foundation of EU product safety laws. Do you have that foundation to build upon, right? Are you building upon a rock? Are you building upon sand? So what are you, does this make sense for your country? I think that's one question that I often ask. And so does it make sense then to cut and paste, what you see in the EU AI Act and you just randomly putting it in your law? I give you an example of Korea, right? And this is something that is quite instructive, I think. So Korea about 2 years ago rushed through this AI law that just came into effect this week. It passed in December 2024. Well, with zero consultation, they just passed it, right? And they basically copied and pasted certain articles from the EU AI Act, so almost word for word. And last year was a very painful year of really trying to sit down to understand what this actually means in the Korean context. Because when they say things like, you have to ensure that anything that is above a certain compute is a high risk AI, and therefore you have to put in all these certain sort of additional transparency measures. They basically changed the concept from EU. In the EU, it's about models. In Korea, they changed the word model to systems, and then we're like, wait a minute, I don't really know, like from the industry point of view, how am I going to calculate compute for every system that we're deploying? Right. So I think that's a challenge. Two, on transparency sort of markers and all of that, they also copied from the EU. But I think at that point, they also didn't realize that the EU Article 50 was, the code of practice had not been sort of written and is still undergoing negotiations right now. So then they were in a bind, right? Because the law actually kicked in this Wednesday, 22nd. But they could not implement this because they did not know how the EU was going to implement this. And so they had at last minute put in a grace period of a year for implementation. So I think this is a lesson like for I think for many in terms of like if you're just copying something from the EU, you run the risk of basically this not being applicable to your context, and then you're caught in a bind when basically the EU itself is unsure and the EU itself is delaying the implementation, and then you become somehow you find yourself in this very awkward position of being almost the first in the world, but basically nobody knows how. So I think that's a huge challenge. The second challenge that Amlan has already brought up is this whole thing about data and language. And it's true, right? Like that most large language models are trained on primarily English-based dominant data sets. There is a performance gap, even though that's closing, for non-English languages. So I think the question is about how do we make that, and this can be part of governance and policy, right? How do you make that more accessible in terms of local languages? How do you make sure that these are reflected in the models that are being trained, not just by US model providers, right, but also by local developers? How do you make sure that these data sets are widely and openly available, so that at the end of the day, the AI is a lot more reflective of local nuances and a lot more inclusive in that way. And then I think the last one I would say, last thing I would mention is, and that's where I really like that mention and that emphasis in the Indian guidelines, is the techno-legal approach to things. So I think that really makes a lot of sense, right? Instead of paper compliance, I think there's a lot of opportunity here to think about how do we make things more robust, right? So on things like watermarking, I think that's a clear thing, right? Watermarking. Can the laws say something like, you have to put in watermarks, but you also have to offer tools for detection, right? And so it's easy then to see if really this was AI generated or not, right? And that is like almost like a digital hallmark, right? That proves provenance, right? Without breaking encryption, without stifling free speech. So creative ways of thinking through, I think, that techno-legal opportunity, and would be very excited to see how India leads in this space, especially given the sort of lack of regulatory capacity for many other global South countries. If India can actually find a formula that works in this area, I think that would be really helpful globally in terms of lifting the standards on AI governance. My final thing, and I'm happy to discuss any of these points later, is that when we think about AI governance, also we shouldn't think about it as a static process. I think it's a living process, and it's not one and done, right? I think it has to necessarily be iterative. This technology is moving at pace, and governance needs to keep up with that. So the more rigid your rules, the more difficult it's going to be to unpick a lot of things. And I think what's a no loss move now is evidence gathering, right? Gather an evidence base. Where are the harms? What's happening? Where are the incidents? And can we extrapolate from there? If there is a certain category of harms that we see happening in this area, then let's think about how to very surgically and in a very targeted manner fix that, right? Think about how to mitigate all of that. So I'll end my remarks here, and I don't know whether that was 10 minutes, but I'm happy to discuss further later. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Neil. So we have Prakash next. So please, Prakash, go ahead.
Okay, mic on. All right. Thanks first, Siddharth, Rahul, and Sudhir for both hosting this event and for inviting me. I'm always delighted to be back at my alma mater as well. So pleasure to be here. And to begin with, congrats, Amlan, on putting together such a comprehensive document, right? Oftentimes, obviously, AI has been around for a while, and there's been lots of discussions around how do we regulate, how do we govern, and what's going to be the impact, and so on. And different ministries have taken the initiative, different organizations have taken the initiative, and sometimes you wonder whether they all have a unified approach. So I think one of the things that I really loved about the governance guidelines is it seems to put all of that together, right? Brings it all together. So and acknowledges that there are a number of issues that different ministries may have and different departments may have their own interpretation of and focus on. But here's a general framework. I'm also glad to hear that this is going to be a living document, because that's one of the, I think, areas that we end up stumbling on, which is you put out a framework or a guidance document like this one, and then it sort of slips into oblivion as other technological or other initiatives sort of take the forefront. So I'm glad to hear that this is going to stay a living document, and then hopefully all the other ministries, governments, and all the other stakeholders really use this as a framework document to focus on, to begin with, all of the short-term, near-term, long-term, mid-term, long-term plans that you set out in the document. So again, congratulations on putting such a comprehensive document together. I think I'm going to try and speak from the perspective of someone who is at a company that is India-based but serves global clients. And to begin with, I'd posit that by that reference, these kinds of companies in developing countries serving global clients, are also part of the global south, right? So when you talk about global south, there's a question for you. Are we talking about just individuals and people and citizens, or are we also talking about organizations, entities, right? Whether they're for-profit businesses or non-governmental organizations or whatever they may be, right? And my argument is that my submission is that we are also part of the global south. Why? Because a company like L&T Technology Services employs a vast number of individuals in the global south. So what are the things that we are thinking about when we talk about AI and AI governance, AI regulation, right? Obviously, there are opportunities and there are challenges. Opportunities, the reason there are a large number of service providers, especially in the IT sector, based out of India and many other countries in the global south, is because we have a skilled population and comfort with language, right? Technically skilled population, comfort with language, and all of that means that we were able to provide all these services for all these years, and that's how the TCSs, Infosys, the L&T Technology Services of India have managed to grow. So the opportunity continues as AI as a technology comes in. Okay, how do we adapt ourselves to providing services to the rest of the world using AI, using the tools that AI provides, make our services more efficient, and cater to the needs of customers and populations around the world. That's the opportunity. And what does that involve? Skilling. And you talk in the governance guidelines about the importance of skilling, right? So completely agree with that. And many of these companies have large skilling programs, and you, I'm sure, can speak to it as well, large skilling programs to upskill their own employees, to be able to adapt to changing technology and technological needs, right? And how to incorporate AI. What does AI mean? What do we mean by, where can we use AI models, agentic AI models, tools, AI tools to provide better service, more efficient service. So that's the opportunity. And companies in the global south, in India in particular, have been focusing on what they can do to upskill their employees, to provide better services, and so on. But where's the challenge? The challenge on the flip side then is also, does that mean we don't need to employ as many people, right? So one of the key issues that, Amlan, again, I'm sure you have rationale for this, and I'm sure this was discussed at the committee, there isn't a huge discussion around employment and the impact on employment in the document. Now, maybe that, in the view of the committee, falls outside governance, and maybe that's more just impact. But again, because the framing of this conversation is in the global south, and if you're taking that expanded view of governance, which I completely agree with, then impact is part of how do you look at governance of impact, perhaps, right? And there are elements, of course, scaling and so on. But that impact of what is it going to do to employment, what is it going to do to revenues, is something that service providers in India are based out of India are very concerned about. Employees, and speaking as an employee myself, they're concerned about that, right? What does this mean? Yes, we can get more efficient, but what does that mean to my job? So that's certainly one of the challenges we keep coming against, right? And you see it in there was this phase of the last maybe 5 years ago. The CEOs of the large companies would say, no, it's going to augment all what you do at work. It's not going to replace you. And you still often hear that argument, but I think that message has sort of toned down, because the fact is that companies also have sort of started talking about, well, maybe we don't need to hire as many this year. So that is, and this does come up when you do town halls and so on, right? Employees do raise this as a concern as to, well, what does this mean to maybe my job is fine because I'm going to, enhance efficiency, and enhancing efficiency and therefore productivity is an important metric through which you increase revenue, increase profit, all of that. But what does it then mean to new joiners, right? Are you going to hire as many people? So those may not be concerns that a current employee may have, but he or she may have those concerns in terms of growth opportunities and then opportunities for the children and so on. So that's still a challenge, and I'd be interested in hearing the rest of the panel's thoughts around, and Amlan, yours in particular as well, as to what your thoughts are on that. But the other aspect that I wanted to touch on was what the paper, its approach to regulation. And again, I really appreciated the way in which the approach is set out as sort of regulation light, right? You don't need to regulate until you find a reason to regulate. Don't just regulate for the sake of regulating. Keep the regulatory burden, and I love the way it's phrased in the paper. Keep the regulatory burden to a minimum. And as a company and as someone at a company, that's what you love to hear, because regulatory burden is obviously a suck on resources, and to the extent that you don't need to add additional resources to sort of think about, okay, how am I going to fill out more forms? Am I just filling out more forms and sending out information to various ministries and so on, just for them to gather information? Don't see where that's leading. But to the extent that obviously it's important to frame where are we going with this, and there's some harm that needs to be prevented, then absolutely that kind of compliance is what companies completely understand that they need to do. The other sort of final thought, perhaps, before we sort of circle back on some of these issues, is thank you again for pointing out the context of this being under AI for inclusive growth, right? That's the mandate from the Prime Minister's office, and again, that I'm sure you had lots of deliberation around what does that mean? Inclusive growth for whom, right? And again, as inclusive growth obviously for all citizens, for all residents, but also again, maybe, and I don't know if you already think about these things, but maybe also from the perspective of economic actors, right? So inclusive growth, meaning growth for those entities that provide job opportunities. So yes, there are lots of, vast majority of India's population is not employed in a white collar job, and so that's only, perhaps that's an area that's sometimes missed. But that's, I think, an important area to also think about, because as we transition further and further towards the services economy, the role of Indian companies from the global south, especially as the geopolitical landscape shifts, right? is going to be increasingly important. So I leave with those thoughts. I'll stop with those thoughts, and then I'm sure we'll circle back on a number of these things. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Prakash. Jaideep, maybe you can go next.
Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Rahul and the Vice Chancellor and the National Law School for inviting me. Happy to be here. It's not my alma mater, though I studied hard for it to be, but I'm back here in another capacity. So I'm going to try and bring a bit of a practitioner's perspective on some of these issues. I don't speak for the firm, but just my own perspectives. So I agree with the thesis of the paper on the Information Technology Act being a suitable, as I read it, umbrella framework for this, but needing an update. I think where the way technology regulation has proceeded, especially for regulating platforms in the last few years, is to retrofit the intermediaries guidelines to regulate all sorts of platform issues that it wasn't originally designed for. Section 79 of the Information Technology Act is a immunity provision. It's sort of a provision that's a successor to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in the US, which essentially aims to provide platforms immunity for third-party content. So the intermediaries guidelines were framed as a list of due diligence standards for a platform to comply with in order to avail safe harbor for third-party content, such as a video hosting platform not being liable for the content of videos posted by its users. So you have to put in place the right TNC. You have to ensure that when you become aware of illegal content, you take it down. What is awareness? Of course, is subject of debate. Is it your own awareness? Is it a court order? And there's been back and forth around the world on that, including in Indian courts. But essentially, the framework is a list of due diligence standards that if you follow it, you are immune from third-party content. But developments in the last few years have come about in a way that essentially this regime of due diligence standards is somewhat retrofitted to become a code of obligations for internet companies, right? Large, small, medium, uh, without being exactly linked to whether we are talking about liability for third-party content or not. Right? It's now just a list of do's and don'ts for internet platforms. Right? And that becomes important in the context of AI because, as the guidelines say, some of the definitions, such as the intermediaries definition, which was essentially now 25 years old for the most part, needs to be revisited in the context of the different actors in the AI ecosystem, whether it's the developers, the deployers, the users, and everyone in between in the chain. So there would be, I think, some benefit to bringing about clarity in where each of these actors stand in the context of the Indian legislation. And of course, recent issues have come up which sort of call for this with a little more urgency in terms of directives to some platforms under this intermediary liability regime. Is that the right framework? Are there other existing provisions in the Information Technology Act? So actually, a plain reading of the Act will actually bring to light some provisions outside the intermediaries liability framework, which could actually address some of the content related issues that come about. There are provisions against impersonation. There are provisions against compromising the privacy of a person, um, including in the context of the private areas, etc. Right? And that is a set of provisions completely different from the intermediary liability framework. So that's, I think, one area that perhaps is the time is right, and maybe it would get discussed in the summit, and something could come of it as to whether this retrofitting has now sort of come to a head, and we may need to rethink the framework. Another example is the whole concept of online curated content. So it's not really an AI theme, but today's OTT platforms are basically regulated under a framework designed for intermediaries publishing third-party content. Although those platforms are publishing their own content, right? So it's when that regime came about, a lot of us asked, how does that exactly tie into the platform being an intermediary? Another aspect to think about is the draft October 2025 amendment on synthetically generated information, which is obviously quite thought-provoking, controversial, depending on how you want to choose the word. So it essentially requires all synthetically generated information to have a labeling with certain prescriptive norms on how that labeling should be done. The problem with defining synthetically generated information in the way that the draft does, right? So the question is, uh, when does one cross the line on what is synthetically generated, right? So is the filter put on a basic photo editing filter put after the picture is taken? Does that not qualify as synthetically generated information? A basic touch-up or any um, commonly used tool, a filter perhaps. Uh, Most of the content that is seen on the internet is arguably synthetically generated, and if all of that needs to be labeled and all of these requirements need to be followed, does that flip from the status quo, right? Where what is assumed is that uh, I think the aim of the amendment is to combat deepfakes, but the framing of the definitions are perhaps overbroad to catch within them a much wider net than perhaps what was intended. And some of the norms being highly prescriptive, such as you need to have, in the case of audio content, the initial 10% of its duration needs to be essentially a disclaimer on synthetically generated content. So let's say you have a 1 hour podcast. You have the first 6 minutes repeating a disclaimer about how this is synthetically generated content if you perhaps done a small edit on the audio. So some of that may need a revisit. Obviously, that was open for public comments, and public comments would have come in. So these are two key themes, I think, from a practitioner's perspective on AI. Of course, just as a sidebar on two other things that I found of interest in comments by Amlan and Yunus were on the US status quo. So obviously the regime of the federal government is quite known and clear to be pro AI, but there is this tension with the state law framework. So there's a California law, there's a Colorado law, which are one is in effect and one will come into effect later this year. And now it's a core constitutional issue on federal preemption of state laws. So again, technology meets constitutional law, and I'm sure the Vice Chancellor will be interested in how that plays out. Because it's a very it's a hundreds of years old issue in the US, but it's having its a new application to the facts as we speak. Uh, and that plays in, I think, with the other theme is on what Eunice said on 69% excited in India versus 33% in the US. Perhaps ties into what you were saying, Prakash, on I think the US is probably the awareness among the public on this whole employment issue is a little ahead because you had this strikes and protests in LA when actors' images were used because you can just do a scan of a person and then have them play the whole role in the rest of the film. So we'll have to see how that awareness spreads here and what's the on ground impact here. I think that will be one to watch. Yeah, so that's about it. Hopefully came in a little under, and thank you. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks a lot, Jerry. Professor Dave?
Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. I interacted with Professor Sudhir several years ago. Coming at the end of round of talks, I always have the trouble of trying to be a little bit more original. So I will begin by dropping numbers, not names. Let me just drop a few just to spur things up a little bit. For example, yesterday, 2.5 billion people or billion prompts were given to ChatGPT. This is an approximation. If you include the other large language models, that number will probably double. That's one. MIT report came out late last year, said 98% of CEOs around the world, CEOs and other senior managers want AI. They want AI. That's 98%. Another MIT report from a sister department in MIT did a huge survey of, again, industrial leaders, CXO people, and came out with another startling number. 95% of Gen AI applications are failures. Only 5% seem to show something that is useful. Another number, the amount of money that's pouring in by the user community, not the supplier side community, not the OpenAIs of the world, is about 50 billion. People are just pouring in money into AI to figure out what can we do with it. There was a delightful comic strip on LinkedIn, which I can't show you, but I do have it with me, which has this leader who's standing there and said, and these are CEOs on the other side who are responding, and he's asking the question, what do we want? CEOs are saying AI. When do we want it? CEOs are saying now. Why do we want it? We don't know. Jokes aside, I post-retirement, I was invited to a number of institutions around Bangalore, mostly outside Bangalore, also by young executives, senior executives. Even yesterday, I was talking to a whole bunch of them. There is both excitement, as Eunice said, hey, what's this stuff? I want to know what it is. I want to use it. There is also palpable anxiety. It is visible. Again, as an aside, I was in a temple last weekend. I'm not a very spiritual or religious person, but I went to this temple to address about 500 executives from companies who were there asking this fundamental question. I thought they were inviting me to talk about spirituality, and I was going to say no. They said no, talk about AI. I do have a book on AI, which is probably why they pick on me. So I went and spoke about AI, and I could sense the worry. Half of them were coders. They work in the tech industry in Bangalore. Now, having said that, having experienced all that, I read the guidelines again. I had read them before, and I was very happy to see there is a clear thinking on the part of the government to put things forward. And I will make some comments, which frankly I have mentioned these before also. I will perhaps repeat them. These are based out of the document. The first one I will say is AI is not singular. It's not an AI or a AI. It's a cluster of technology. There's a whole bunch of things that go into what is being called AI, and I believe some of it is erroneous, and some of it is fine. It's a blur. You and I have been using AI since Google came up with the search engine, which was in 2000. That is AI, technically speaking. So first, we have to be clear. Within AI, I would like to draw a broad distinction. There is this Gen AI thing that's happening today, which is this based on these language models and which all of us have access to. There was another AI, which was actually the boom AI, which was called deep learning models, which some people now call analytical AI, some call predictive AI. The difference between the two is one of them, the predictive AI, gives you the same answer even if you ask the same question repeatedly. Okay, if you give it an X-ray of an image and it is a healthy and not cancerous tissue, it will say healthy, point blank, healthy repeatedly. Not the case with this Gen AI, which will vary it constantly. Every time you ask the question, hey, what's up here, it will give you a different answer because it is designed to do that by design. So the Gen AI hallucinates and gives you variable answers, and even if you ask the same question, give you different answers by design. The predictive AI gives you the same answer for the same input by design. These are two very different technologies in how they come to us, where we react. I saw in the beginning part of the report that you are sort of comparing nuclear tech, biotech with AI and electricity. I will again like to differ a little bit. Nuclear tech, biotech, very powerful technologies. They are not something you and I have access to. It is mainly done by other very large corporations with deep pockets or by governments. Electricity is a different one. He has electricity in there also. Electricity came to all of us. Now we can do a bunch of things with electricity, and we have. AI, when it is coming to us, everybody has access. If you have a phone today, a smartphone with language access, not a feature phone, you can use AI and you can do a bunch of things with it. The afford answers are immediately available to anybody on the planet, which is now roughly about 5 billion people have access to these technologies. Very different from nuclear tech and biotech. So in terms of thinking about these technologies, we have to be very conscious. This has come to us very rapidly, very fast, extremely powerful. And it also has hallucinatory properties. It will do and say things which are very different. Now, along these lines, one of my requests is governance or documents such as this are in a way setting the tone for all of us, telling us, look, Indian government thinks this is good stuff and this not so good stuff, broadly speaking. Work on this, don't worry. They're not saying, I'll stop you, I'll fine you. They're not saying this, don't do this stuff. This is not so good. I think that is fine. That's good. We should know that, which is what is the direction in which we should proceed. I also feel we should sustain this. So I may differ with Amlan and Yunus, who are saying we need a fluid document. Fluid, yes, but we also need a document which actually tells you, look, guys, don't go there. It's not that we right now, go ahead, do something, but 2 years down the line, I've poured in effort in investments, etc. And you say, no, you can't do that. Or I'll be very concrete here. European Union has the right to be forgotten. They have this, if I give information, you have a right to be forgotten. Now, this puts a jam, serious jam, to a lot of technology companies, which have, for example, invested in blockchain technology. You cannot forget anything in a blockchain. Frankly, you cannot even forget anything in an ERP, which all of us are using now. The modern ERPs, if you go into their into their guts, it's a nightmare. If the government says, okay, remove everything Prakash has said in the last 10 years, I'm sunk. Many of us are in deep trouble here. That's why I'm saying there should be some thinking along, go ahead, build, but please let us also know where you're going to pull back so that we can be ready for this. Now, I think there were references, not in the document, but I think later on, I think in speeches we mentioned sovereign tech. I'm not sure I fully understand what it is, so I was very happy it was not there. Uh, the part I was not so happy that was missing was open source. The open source is, I will say, the three pillars of why we are in AI today. I began in AI in 1987. I did my PhD in it. There was no open source then. There was no huge amount of data. There was no cloud. There was no open source. Those three are what has given the impetus to what we are, where we are today. We have to recognize open source, its value, and open source models, how to build them, where they are, what they can do. Another number I didn't drop, but I will drop it now. Hugging Face has 2.4 million models. 2.4 million models. And by the way, this doubled in the last 2 months. I've been watching Hugging Face. I go and count the number of models they have. Even the number of data sets they have, which is open to all of us, has doubled in the last few months. This is humongous. This is a massive resource sitting there for us to basically deploy and use. There is a lot of talk and there is a lot of thinking around why we can become in India or in the global south, how we can build these models up for our use. Oftentimes I only hear these 3-4 big families today. These families are Google, OpenAI, Grok, and Claude. These families keep showing up like the Tatas and Birlas of when I was growing up. But there are 2.4 million ordinary guys. Of course, there are also many of them contributed to by these big families, which are usable. And I strongly urge us to consider that very strongly. Now, I will close here by saying the two things that I would have liked to have seen is, and I think it has to be regulated, there is no way out. One is data labeling. Data labeling at a lower estimate is a $5 billion industry, mostly being done in the global south. There are, if you read Murjia's book or Karen Howe's book, they talk about what a trauma it is for labelers. There are many in India. And it is only likely to grow. This should be regulated. I do not agree it should go unregulated. One. Two, education. I'm an educator. I know what is going on and I see what is going on with Gen AI use in education. I think it is devastating. We had a workshop yesterday on the IMD campus, again talking about this whole issue. Some of us, oldies like me, took a stand saying, please don't review papers. Like, when people submit papers to journals, reviewing is being done by AI. I'm sort of begging people, don't review papers, please. You can take help to write if you like. Again, I don't agree with it. But I'm saying put a stop to this. It's very hard to implement. You can't chase people around in their homes when they're reading papers. But at least we should step up and say, stop this. At least stop this part of it. I had a discussion with another vice chancellor of a university who was furious that grading is being done by AI. He said, why are my teachers for? Why are they here? They are supposed to grade. This is the task of the teacher to tell the students themselves. I've read your response. I think this is what is right. This is what is wrong. I think these are some hard situations where we have to take a clear stand. Nothing doing. I do not agree. As government, I do not agree. I think this is the right way to do. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Krishnaswamy.
Yeah, thanks, Rahul, for and Siddharth and the rest of the team for putting this panel together. Rahul mentioned at the start that we've done 3 sessions every weekend on the in the build up to the AI summit later this February, and each of these sessions have been very different. Some have been more focused on social science and anthropological work. The last weekend was more focused on a history of regulation of tech, especially the internet and AI. And this weekend we have more of a policy and governance conversation. And I think taken together gives everyone a reasonable sense of the state of discussion, at least in academic spaces, on issues like these. I'm going to stay with the format that Amlan set up. I want to say a little bit about governance and how I read the document. I want to say something about the idea of tech policy, because I think Amlan suggested that really we should look at these documents as not a governance document in a conventional sense, but really as a tech policy document coming from the global south. And I want to focus on what is the global south. And so the hat I wear in a conversation like this is as someone who's worked on questions on tech policy and governance for some time, like Rahul has, and let's draw on some of this earlier understanding, because we have a huge problem in the AI space. Rahul hinted to this, which is that somehow we are expected to believe that AI is de novo everything. Never seen before. We cannot imagine it. It's mind-boggling. No one can understand it. You can't understand the tech. Forget about the question of regulation. And all the non-knowers better stay far away. You don't even know what you're talking about. And I think this kind of discourse emerges in most new technology areas. There is some novelty, there is a learning curve, but the idea that the response to novelty is this state of unknowingness, that somehow everyone should just be hands off, is a very strange idea. And I think the AI discourse is infected with this strangeness through and through. Right? And I think that as educators and as citizens, we should be deeply concerned by anybody who tells us, you don't know what this is about, just stay far away. But it's going to change your life. It's going to be terribly important. Don't do anything about it, because there's great stuff on the way. And we should be naturally skeptical of these kinds of positions and claims. And that's where I come from when I look at materials like this. So the first thing I did looking at the governance document, and I suggested this to Amlan just before we got started today, that it's not a governance document at all. At best, out of the 60 odd pages, maybe about 5 or 7 pages are about governance. At best. So why is it called a governance document? And it seems to me, and I'm going to suggest this reframing, that it's not a governance of AI document. There is some stuff about DEPA which is interesting, and some stuff about 79 and intermediary guidelines, very interesting. But the rest of the document is about governance by AI. How can you deploy AI tools in a range of governance landscapes? So the idea is that somehow the state is going to become, unlike what we would normally expect in tech policy, the early adopter. This is India's claim to uniqueness and novelty in the space. We are going to be early adopters. Generally, in technology histories, technology stories, early adopters are these geeks hiding in basements. They are the people who get to technology first, discover some interesting applications, and so on. And the sense that one gets reading this document is, for some reason, that configuration has changed. Now the state is the early adopter, the state is the evangelist, the state is the booster for the AI landscape. And it's a very strange inversion in the history of technology that we might set ourselves up like this, that this is a governance by AI document. AI is going to change government. Very similar to an argument we heard before in the Puttaswamy case about Aadhaar. Hmm? Very similar position that Aadhaar is going to change everything. Everything of what? Everything of the delivery of government. The tonality of this document is very similar. The tonality of the document is that AI is going to change everything. We should now get ahead of the curve and really run with it. So the first point that I want to make is about the governance, the idea of governance. Generally, we think of the state, the role of the state, not as a player in the tech game. We think of the role of the state as the entity that draws some boundary lines, as Rahul was suggesting, that sets up the rules. But suddenly, in the Indian context, the state is the player. We are going to be the architect, meaning the state is going to be the architect of how AI plays out. It's not only going to be an adopter, it's going to provide compute, it's going to effectively get into the inside of this tech domain. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that a priori there's something wrong with that. States can have roles, but it's new. This is a new idea. And it's maybe, as some of the early statements ahead of the summit suggest, this is our contribution to the debate. This is this claim that we provide DPIs for the world, and somehow AI is also a DPI. And it's not clear to me at all, by any configuration, contortion of the phrase DPI, how AI is a DPI, but that's what we would have you begin this discussion with. Potentially, maybe the use case is the DPI or something like that. So that's my first comment. Just some clarity on what does governance mean. And it's not that we can't write other documents about AI. We should just call it something else. They're not governance documents, they're something else. That's my first point of reference. The second is to get into the innards of what might a tech policy look like. And here I'm going to be slightly historical. A tech policy I'm going to take as, and I'm going to take Amlan's prompt on this, is a version of an industrial policy for the contemporary age. In the 1950s, we said we would do import substitution in high capital manufacturing. And we set up large public sector corporations, which were meant to provide both capital goods and other forms of advancement in industrial manufacturing. That is industrial policy in the 1950s and 60s. At a certain point in time, we adopt a policy with respect to IT. I'm going to say a little bit about that. We adopt a very significant policy in the 1960s to deal with drugs. I'm going to say a little bit about that. And then I'm going to look at AI policy with these perspectives in mind. I'm going to say nothing about industrial policy for the moment. Let's assume that this document is actually a document about the role of the state in this new technology. So it's a kind of technology policy document. So India was an early mover in a core adoption of a switching technology in the 1980s, and I'm talking now about telecom switching. And we invested in the creation of C-DOT, as it was then called, which developed some indigenized versions of switching technologies because we were not able to participate in the global market to purchase them at value, and we had some tech restrictions on the use of switching technologies in early telecom. Along with the adoption of switching technologies came the willingness to get into computers, And the computer question was resolved in two ways. First, we built early semiconductor fab technologies in India. So, and I think these details are important. How we approach the question of value chain, right? There was an attempt to build semiconductor fabs in India, and then at a later stage, the wholesale adoption of computers, the purchase of computers, liberalized purchase of computers, which was a position taken against the then grain of import substitution. Right. So why do I provide this technology, this background? Because the pivot towards not going to import substitution was pushed by the technology industry, much of which is in this city, to suggest that we should not try to redo the value chain in the hardware side, that we would do very well if we just stuck to the software side. And we vacated the value chain on hardware in the late 1980s. Not that it was going swellingly well, but India was not bad in the early semiconductor fab race. We were certainly at the level that Korea was at in the mid 1980s. And as a matter of policy, we chose to participate in the software question. And it's very interesting how we approached the software question. We saw the software question as not making platform software technologies, but being application service providers. This was a strategic decision taken in the 1990s. Some might say it has paid off. We are a very large provider of application services software, and the Indian economy has benefited significantly from this. This is tech policy. When we say, what is tech policy? This is tech policy. But in that tech policy, we made important, at least gestures to the idea that we would push towards non-proprietary ownership of software. We excluded it from the Patents Act in the early versions, and we were very reluctant to provide strong copyright protection to computer software. And the position was normatively aligned towards open source models, but we can't claim, India cannot claim that we were the originators of or sustainers of the greatest open source models. We can't claim that. We were reasonable adopters of the open source software technology, but that could have been an interesting pivot. I raised this story because that is the governance question. You make a governance choice in how you want to approach a technology. And our approach to software was non-proprietary. That was the government's position. And we took a lot of flack for it, including US 301 special trade action on the question of copyright in software. So for those who are familiar with those stories, that is tech policy, that is policy and governance. We took a similar position with respect to pharmaceutical drugs. In 1967, the government committee took the view that we should not allow product patents. Talking about techno-legal strategy, that's techno-legal strategy. The idea was that if India could participate in the biochemistry value chain in pharmaceuticals, in which we were nowhere in the 1960s, what could we do? And the idea was we should not allow product patents. Let's only allow process patents in drugs, and let us allow for Indian participation, technological industrial participation in the value chain in drug production. Now, I think the most cynical person in this room about India and its past will have to concede that that was one of the most successful global pivots on tech regulation in the history of tech regulation. Not just in the global south, but just in the way you think about law and technology and the economy. So the question that I ask in this, if we take the AI governance position that we are trying to develop as a tech policy position, what is our policy? Is our policy, to start with, a priori, that we are only application service providers? Is that so? When we say that, as the document says, that we will sharply engage with use case modeling, this is going to be our path to riches, path to the future. But there is no gesture, from what I have read, to how we might go into the value chain that makes up this new technology. Now, I do know, and we are all aware, that India has invested in developing some language models using Indian languages. We also know that India has invested in the compute with a compute strategy, but the compute strategy is at a, and we also have a semiconductor strategy. So maybe we're just biding our time, we might think. But is there an articulation of and a techno-legal strategy that assures us as ordinary citizens and users that 10 years down the line, that India is somewhere in this value chain? And I'm curious, as a provocative question to the document, where do we see that intervention? So let me close with a final comment about the global south. I think that Amlan's reference to Mark Carney's speech at Davos a few days ago was interesting. The middling power question of what is the global south, and I think we might want to configure this question like this: that the global south depends on what you ask. So in the AI space, I think Amlan is absolutely right. There are two givers, and the rest of the world are takers. So Canada is not that different from India. They may have some advantages. I'm going to mention a few, but more or less, it's the US and China, and the rest of the world is reasonably similarly placed with respect to the new technology. So maybe we ask that question. But whenever we use a phrase like global south, we usually use that phrase in a political economy sense. Right? So it's not a phrase saying just who are the makers and who are the takers. It's a phrase saying who wins and who loses. That's a different question. In a political economy framework, the winners and losers question calls for a deeper articulation of what's at stake. The interesting work that has been done in the field of AI, which is not in the governance document, is to go from base materiality to the application edge of the technology. So let's ask the question, who has the critical minerals? What are we going to do about that? Let's ask the question, who makes the fab? And who has the design capacities to make these chips? How do we get into that? Let's ask the question, who makes the base models? And the base models are working off some training data. Who makes the training data? And how open is that? What is our intervention to that question? And then to ask the question, if we're not going to make large language models ourselves, maybe it's a waste of money. I don't know. Some people think so, others don't. Maybe we make small language models, or we make some variation on the theme. Do we have a position on that? And that is not in the paper, from what I can tell. And lastly, if we have these large language models and there are serious unknown risk questions, and you're right that the frontier states need to embrace the risk proposition seriously. And I have heard as much as I suppose you have the skepticism about the EU AI Act positions, like what is difference going to make the EU? Is the EU a significant enough player in AI to begin asking this question? Is the way that people might phrase it. But I do think that the global south does have a stake in the risk question. And even as takers, for the most part, we're just that. We're takers of the technology. We have a stake in our collective humanity, and we can take a normative position. Rahul suggested as much. There can be some no-go areas and so on. And there's reasonable cause for us to take these positions. It's not like we must be too grand and take out all kinds of things we have no real meaningful stake in. That's not what I'm suggesting that a global south policy might look like. But at the very least, a global south policy must give an account of where in the AI layers political economy the global south stands. And for me, that it's not a given that the position today is the position in 2030 or the position in 2050. I assume that forward-looking documents, policy documents, are about gesturing towards a possible future, right? A future which is slightly different, if not completely different, from the way the AI landscape is set up today. So that's my take on the three elements. How do we think about governance? What do we think about tech policy? And what is a global South view on this field? Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Krishnaswamy. So we have around half an hour for questions, but I think there are a few provocations offered by the panelists already, including majorly on what is not there in the document. So I'd actually like first Amlan and Yunus to respond to some of these claims of the document and the idea that governance guidelines don't have. And we have a question in chat also which signals at this, where Akshay has asked, one of the things that's not considered in the guidelines is the significant environmental footprint that AI has. So data labeling, open source, tech policy, and a place of AI in where's India's place in the supply chain, questions of future of tech work, questions of what are the possible legal sort of changes. So there's a lot out there. So before I open up to questions from the audience, perhaps Amlan and Yunus would like to respond to any one of the points that they think they have some sort of response to. Yeah, Amlan.
Thanks, Rahul. Okay. Really interesting, right? Wish we had more than 30 minutes. I'll try to do this in 5 minutes though, right? I want to maybe respond to three things. One is, I think the AI rhetoric discourse point that, Professor Sudhir mentioned, briefly want to say, and tying it to kind of what Yunus said on the optimism in India. It's true, like all of the stats show that. I think it's very palpable when you have these conversations with the entrepreneurs, with the government officials, the common person in many ways, right, about their optimism around AI. I would agree with Sudhir is to really question that. I think we should all be skeptical about that optimism and really ask for ourselves, where do we stand on that, right? Because I think, it's dictated obviously by very factual questions like, the existential frontier safety risks are not as present in India. We're not building those frontier models. So, you can understand why there's some doom and gloom in the US and maybe in Europe, less so in India. But, question that, right? Question, for example, like the media narrative, right? A lot of this is being influenced by the success of the DPI story. And like UPI is great, but, there are some downsides to that. So are we still being fed that kind of, optimistic approach to AI? I would just kind of put that definitely on the table. Two is, kind of my response to that is always kind of have an experiential first-person approach to that. So in my own work, like researching the technology trends, I do a lot of foresight work on where, 2030, where we'll be on 2030, 2035. My sense is generally I think of myself as a kind of rationalist or realist. There are upsides and downsides. I think the technology will progress incredibly well. We're going to get really capable, highly autonomous systems in the next 3 to 5 years, AGI potentially, whatever that means. But we need to be very mindful of the downsides as well, right? So I think they're going to be really capable, but let's be very mindful of the risks as well. And third piece, I think on the role of the state, right? I think the fact is that, I have also questioned the role of the state in many of these areas in AI, like on compute, like should you be acquiring the GPUs? Probably not. They have this model now, this public-private partnership. Maybe I think that's a little better, but again, really should be questioning, I think, the role of the state, especially on questions of sovereign AI. I think the state definitely has a role to play. But I think, really fundamentally, there are risks to the state being very closely involved with AI and policy development, but also as an adopter. I think the biggest risk, even in the US, they agree, is that the combination of an authoritarian state plus AI. And I think if the US and everyone else can agree that there is that risk, then I think there's definitely need to question the role of the state in AI. On the scope piece, right, of the guidelines, look here, I'm not going to comment as a member of the committee, just my personal view. I'll concede that there are some specific issues that weren't discussed: labor, environmental impact. Whether this was conscious or not, I'll just point you to a blog post I wrote, kind of defending some criticism around the guidelines. And I think on the labor piece specifically, I'll say three things, right? One is that this labor impact has not traditionally been part of the AI risk taxonomy, that it's more around malicious users and, bias and so on. But I think I concede, at least in that blog post, that we should have addressed the labor impact issues. And of course, because it's a living document, we probably will down the line, right? Similarly, I think for environmental impact, it's convenient to say we want an expansive view of governance. to promote the technology, but to not have that expensive view when it comes to the risk, I think was this bit disingenuous of us. I think probably informing that, again, this is not as the committee, just my kind of view talking to government, is the Indian government, I think, is confused about what the labor impact will be. On some cases, they say, it's going to have very limited impact because, it's going to impact knowledge workers, high cognitive tasks, which is not what the Indian labor market is about. On the other hand, there's a lot of fear and anxiety. There is the transport minister saying we'll never allow self-driving cars because, it'll make all of our drivers unemployed. So there's confusion. And I think I describe this as, willful blindsidedness. They don't want the data because then they'll have to do something about it. So let's not explore that question. Don't quote me on this, but this is being recorded. I don't know. Finally, on the regulation piece, I feel like my law degree will be withdrawn because I haven't spoken enough about the regulatory piece. But I was very glad Jaideep mentioned all of the points. They're in the governance guidelines, to be fair. We've engaged with these questions. I can just share that regulation is coming on some issues, right? You'll see that on data. I just want to kind of, for the students in the room, there's a blank slate here. Please engage on these scholarship questions on data. Is it even the data protection governance framework? Does it make sense for the AI age? What parts of agency do we need to retain? Some principles around purpose limitation do we need to kind of rethink? So engage with that. Engage on the copyright question. I think the platform classification liability question is fundamental. We're already engaging on that. MeitY is already drawing up kind of amendments to that. So that will happen. On the techno-legal approach, I'll just say, my view is that, there's a role for techno-legal approaches where the regulation can't keep up. So on child safety, for example, if you want to pass a law, addressing some of the foundational important child safety issues with AI, you're going to be waiting 12 to 18 months for a law to pass. That's where you need a techno-legal approach. And I'm glad to see at least some companies are doing age assurance, doing parental controls in a technology-first approach. On other issues like data portability, which has been a very techno-legal approach first in India, that's where I feel we need a law. That's where it's not sufficient to say that companies will allow data portability through Google Takeout and so on. I want a right in the law to be able to say, if you're not allowing me to transfer my data from one platform to the other, very critical with AI systems, I want to be able to assert that. So, I think there's a lot. And then finally, I think on implementation, people have raised that issue. It's one thing to have that document. How do we implement it? I think there's an institutional framework here in place, an AI governance group, expert committee, which will actually help implement the guidelines in the way that they've been envisaged. So I think that's a critical element of the governance guidelines as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Yunus, do you want to respond to anything that any of the other panelists said very quickly?
Yeah, so I think I want to cover most of it. I think to some extent I'll agree with Professor Sudhir in that, if we think strictly about governance, the word governance guidelines, it's are these truly 100% governance guidelines? I think the way I see it is it's an expression of faith or intent. It's basically directionally, this is where India is going, right? Whether you want to dispute about whether this is the governance guidelines or not, I think it's, regardless, I think it's a helpful pulling together of the different elements. So I think that's the first point. The second point is that I think, sort of reading through it, the authors also acknowledge that there are many things that needs to be done after this, right? So basically, how do you define AI risk? How do you classify AI risk in the Indian context, right? The way that Europe thinks about risk is very different from the way that India will think about AI risk, right? So what does that mean in a practical context in India? I think these are work streams that ought to and will be sort of continuing as part of this, and I think that's important to note. On the point about environment, climate impact, I know that I think under Sutra 7, there is something about sort of being environmentally sustainable, sort of sustainability, but that probably needs to be fleshed out a little bit. I would point out that, I think the environmental impacts are very real, and we're hearing that these are concerns, right, that people not just in India but all over the world have, but also would encourage sort of thinking about how do you then make sure that sort of when large companies like mine, all right, come into India, they come in clean. Um, and I would say, like our recent investment in AP, right, was not just we're building a data center. We are adding clean energy to the grid, right? So how do you incentivize such things, such that you are not just drawing and sort of extracting, but you are contributing sort of to building the grid, to building transmission lines, to landing subsea cables for connectivity, um, and thinking more from a broader sort of how does this help India at the end of the day point of view. And then the last point I would mention is about where is India's role, what is India's role in the ecosystem, right? Like which layer of the stack, uh, what makes sense for India. I come from a very small country, right? Singapore. And Singapore has basically made the decision that that's not where we're going to play. We're too small, right? There's no point trying to be like, Korea or whatever, to train a language model, foundation model from scratch. That's not what we're concerned about, because we understand the trade-offs, and we would rather deploy these resources towards things that we are very concerned about. So they have invested a lot of money in gathering Southeast Asia data sets, language data, cultural data, and training a very small model called Sea Lion that's built on top of these data sets, but built on top of open models, right? So they built one on, and interestingly, they've built one on Gemma, right, which is Google's open model. They've also built one on Qwen, which is a Chinese model, right? So I'm just throwing this out there to say that, look, let's think about trade-offs. Let's think about where India's strengths are, and where you can benefit most, and where your people will benefit most from this going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Eunice. Professor Krishnaswamy had a small.
Just a small point to say that I like Eunice's example about choosing the point in the value chain to make an intervention. But I trust that for a country India's size, we might have a bigger uh, ambition around these new technologies. And so at least the pathway is interesting. And I think this pathway would be important for the global south more generally, right? It's not just it's a thinking through of where you make an intervention and then how do you work through the value chain. But I just have a small prompt for both Jaideep and for Amlan, because the no regulation position or the no new AI law position is a position that develops in the US and in some parts of England in a very different legal context, and I'll be very short about this. The default idea is when you don't pass statutes and you don't make new rules, the matter will be resolved by the common law, either tort or some other field of law. In India, that is not true. The matter will be resolved by criminal law. And this understanding, I think, is very, very poor among tech policy folks. But we just don't even open our eyes. The next time that there's a Grok type issue around a sexualized presentation of materials, there'll be 200 FIRs. And that is how we resolve these questions in India. And so the kind of hands-off idea that, okay, we just sit back, the technology evolves, some mistakes get made. Just imagine what would happen in a suicide abetting case in India. And you can get an idea that it's not like the US model. You're not going to have grand conversations about what is a human life worth and so on. There are going to be about 4 or 5 people in jail. And then the name of the game is how do you get them out? Very different conversation. And which is why I feel that we might want to think about how we toggle between the don't regulate versus the regulate light is fine with me. I mean, I get it that it's a new technology. And we might just want to think about that, the alternatives there more carefully as lawyers. Yeah.
We'll take questions. If you're online, please do raise your hand or write down your question in chat. If you raise your hand, I'll try and give you microphone access. In the room, please raise your hand if you have questions. Yes, please.
Hi. So my background is as a competition lawyer, I'm Priti, also ex-student. But sorry, am I audible? Am I audible now? So yeah, just kind of circling back to that point on governance that Professor Sudhir just made. Another, I mean, I wouldn't say a miss, but another sort of notable absence is actually the impact of competition law and how that kind of plays into, how AI and digital markets generally are turning out to be regulated, right? Because this battle is ongoing. The CCI is going to have to intervene at some point. They have in certain cases. You have a competition act, just like your criminal law. You have competition law that's going to, end up a competition commission that's possibly going to end up imposing fines, but more crucially, impose remedies that change the way in which the technology is deployed, not just in India, but globally. And that's been called the Brussels effect. We've had a lot of, not a very charitable word, but like a lot of copycat cases that have happened in the last few years. And the position is sort of converging. So I guess 2 points, right? One is, as an imperative, I think from a governance perspective, inter sort of departmental coordination is going to be very important, because it's not as if the CCI can sit back and say, we're going to wait for, or we're going to toss the ball to MIT, we're going to toss the ball to the MIT, or any other regulatory authority, or the DPDP board, for instance. We're already seeing that the CCI is open to intervening, and we have several judgments, I think, the last year that are interesting from a competition law perspective, that talk about how the CCI is going to move in parallel with other regulatory bodies. Because actually the CCI is, I mean, there is one mention of the CCI as a sectoral regulator. Just to say, they're not a sectoral regulator, right? Because they're actually horizontal across various sectors, and they do apply to every single business. And just that the conversation on digital markets regulation and competition being so live and so heated and having very real consequences, not just for end users, but also like the deployers of technology. I think that's something that we're going to have to watch for, because that's going to be another frontier where, regulators are going to have to step in.
We'll take a bunch of questions. Please keep your questions short and just ask one question if possible. Yes.
So thank you everyone for the insightful session. My question is specifically to Mr. Jaideep Reddy. So sir, you mentioned about how DPDP rules definition of synthetically generated information may capture a lot of things, from, let's say, photo filters to basic edits. My simple question was, has there been any industry effort to propose a threshold-based definition, which perhaps distinguishing between contents where AI is the primary creative engine, or where it is a mere enhancement tool? And would such a tiered-based approach be workable for platforms?
Yeah, Isha.
Yeah. Right. So, right. So I'm sorry, it's not good. It's slightly long, not a short question, but so I mean, again, so following from what Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy said, I want to problematize this idea of regulation as opposed to sort of a hands-off approach. Now, from what I looked at the AI guidelines, it follows so I'm quoting from the guidelines itself, it follows a trust but verify later model, right? As opposed to a more precautionary principle-led approach, and self-regulation is prioritized, and it says that we need to prioritize innovation over restraint. Now, the issue is that when we look at regulation, we have this idea, so probably we labor under the ghost of the license Raj and so on, that we think of regulation as this highly restrictive ideal as opposed to enabling. And we think that regulation necessarily entails rent seeking. So which is why we need to, if we have to incentivize innovation, we have to not regulate. And usually the model that it takes is restricting rights, right? Now the issue is that good innovation policy usually is generally incentivized as a result of working with competition laws and IP, and not necessarily, restricting sort of fundamental rights or transparency, accountability, and so on. So my question is that obviously we will see over time how AI policy in this country interacts with fundamental rights to equality, free expression, privacy, and so on. But did you look at sort of right to information and how that can be integrated into AI governance? And by right to information, I don't just mean, I know there is a specific a policy prescription there that says that AI companies will need to disclose and there needs to be disclaimers and so on. But it follows more on the model of having terms, so it's something similar to disclosing terms and conditions, right? But what I mean by right to information is all we need is probably just a centralized ledger of, okay, these are the, at present in the country, either with the government or private players, these are the types of AI models which are being used, either when you file for job applications or whether you, I mean, the extent to which they're being used in delivery of welfare services, policing, surveillance, and so on, so that civil society groups and public spirited citizens, they have access to all of these materials and they just they can work with this and just try and find out, okay, what are the issues that can arise, and then so that there is more lively public debate, because right now there is so much non-transparency with the way that it's, so thank you so much and sorry for the extended response.
Hi everyone, I'm Avishkar. So I'll ask very short question. But shall we treat AI whenever we are thinking about developing structure of governance and law as any other form of technology? So can we consider that technology is a larger subset? AI is just a small subset. First thing. Second thing, if we are not treating AI and if we are treating AI as something beyond technology itself, something which is not synonymous, something new, then what all fundamental factors we should put in a footnote when we are developing any legal system or any governance mechanism? I'll give just little context. Like for nuclear technology regulation, we have NPT that is very, very different. For development of interballistic missile technology and provision of dual use technology, we have a SNR and Australia group regulation. So we see that, okay, we are having similar structure and standards for biomedical, biotechnological technology regulation. So there, the fear factor is that the loss will be so much, loss of life will be. In case of AI, what should be our approach?
We have a question on chat, which is the AI governance guidelines idea of innovation over restraint contrasts with the PSA's framework that was released yesterday, which talks about ex ante architectural enforcement, effectively codifying a unique Indian techno-legal jurisprudence. Does compliance by design model risk becoming a non-tariff barrier for Indian startups working towards AI? How can we harmonize these sovereign protocols with frameworks like the EU AI Act without diluting our specific technical safeguards? Or do we go towards an alternative way that the global south can argue for? So maybe, Jaideep, I think there were a couple of questions that you can address, and then maybe we can go to Amlan and Professor Day. I don't know if you have any comments.
Sure. Just on the one on synthetically generated information. So that's actually under the intermediaries rules. It's a draft amendment to the intermediaries rules, not the DPDP Act. I think it would be useful to have some form of threshold discussed, which is not currently discussed. Unfortunately, your comment for window for comments is closed, but I'm sure you can still make a submission because there is that's not been finalized yet. And you could also consider perhaps publishing something because while I may have missed something, I'm not aware of any detailed piece which has picked apart that definition and has proposed some thresholds and gradients on it.
Prakash, would you like to add something? Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I mean, first, Amlan, I hope this doesn't sound like this is a personal drilling of everything, you know. So thank you for indulging all of us. But Sudhir, I think, you know, your thought and perspective go towards policy, right? And policy direction for the country, right? And then by extension, perhaps to the global south and leaving aside questions of what the global south is. I don't think this document, forget how it's titled, I don't think the terms of reference intended this to be a policy document of any sort. And so, which raises a separate question of, do we need a policy document? Which we do. I mean, do we need a policy? Maybe we don't need a policy document. And does the government have a policy? And perhaps it does. And we don't know what that policy is. But certainly some of the measures that they have taken suggest that they do have they have put thought towards it, and whether it's, and maybe the interim measure is, okay, we are going to import GPUs, we are going to use existing technology that we do not have to not miss the boat at this time while we develop internal capacity, whether it's chips and so on through the value chain. So it goes back to your fundamental question of where are we inserting ourselves in the value chain, and given the size of our nation, perhaps everywhere. But is there a coherent thought around that? I mean, interesting question, and perhaps we just don't know, and perhaps there isn't enough dialogue around that. Thank you.
So Rahul, do you have?
I'll be able to comment only on one question, which is about technology. I do believe this set of technologies are sufficiently different from, I'll take examples of the internal combustion engine or fertilizer. Each of those, we really don't need to know the internal combustion engine. It works in cars, moves us, transports. We do need to understand that it has an environmental impact and it requires some input. But we don't need to get into all the physics behind it and all that. Likewise for fertilizer. For AI, I believe the story is significantly different. The cluster of technologies, and here I will refer to this comment, we have to inform ourselves, be very conscious of how these things are made. So we need that literacy about AI, and because these technologies have very different affordances. It's not like fertilizer, it will go, put potash or something in your plants, make them grow better. It is changing the way we think. It is changing our entire consciousness. And I'm very worried about this. The phrase being used by scientists, AI scientists, are saying civilizational knowledge is embedded in these large language models because they have sucked out everything from whatever, every digitalized version of whatever there was has been sucked in, and it is called civilizational knowledge. I'm sorry, I strongly disagree. It is not civilizational knowledge. Today, when our startups are building models in Tamil and Telugu, they're struggling because there's not enough text that they can push into these models. Even in Hindi is the most largely spoken here in India, it's not there. This is substantively more, I don't want to use negative words, but it's substantively more influential on us as a collective than anything else we've seen before. I don't believe I'm exaggerating this. This is very serious, and that's why, for the right reasons, all our governments have woken up and said, hey, we need to say something about this. We got to have a say in this. Perhaps we are excited about it. Tamlan and Yunus are saying this. I have smelt the anxiety very strongly. That is right. As an educator, I personally am very worried. I have parents coming up to me telling me, should I give this to my child? Should I let them have this? These are very serious issues. So, in short, no, it's not the same thing. It is not something we can just take as a black box and figure out what it does. We have to be conscious of it and understand it.
Thank you, Professor Day. Anand, I'm going to hold on because I think all of the questions are eventually going to come back to you, so I'll let you have the last word. But let me indulge some of the panelists' time and take one last bunch of questions if all of you have around 10 minutes more. So there are a couple of questions online. So Sukriti, I've given you mic access. Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for organizing this, and thank you to all panelists for this enriching discussion. So my question is, since enabling AI to the use of AI, there are many interplay of different ministries and organizations. So do you think a central regulation would be appropriate, or regulation coming from different regulatory authorities, be it RBI or SEBI, would be more appropriate way to go when especially we are talking about the enforcement capacity and regulatory coherence in India.
Thanks, Sukriti. Neil, go ahead.
So my question is largely to Eunice, and this is from a policy point of view. So when we look at AI trust policies, even in the global south, there is a divergence in different countries. So, for instance, Singapore has something like a voluntary assurance model, wherein tools like AI Verify are being used to give an assurance to the market. But when you look at India, we have a governance by architecture, that in your technical architecture you build inbuilt trust models. So how do you think that the next decade looks like in the APAC region, and how it moves towards either of these, whether a governance by assurance is a preferred model or whether it's governance by architecture that works?
Thanks, Neil. Rashi?
Hi. My question is more on the data point, which was mentioned before also. But to the extent we talk about sovereign AI to a certain extent, and you also mentioned that for label questions, the data was an issue. But when we talk about regulation of AI, would we not need to know like what is the impact of AI? For instance, there was a podcast by The Economist which mentioned how the AI slobs that everyone is worried about, for instance, in publishing, there might not be actual data of those being highly preferable than the generic, like, by human author works. So my question is, if the question, like, we do need to know by data, what is the impact of AI in in different industries? For instance, the copyright guidelines also, they assume that we have this impact on it, which to a certain extent might not be based on India, but outside. So wouldn't that be kind of a techno-colonization that we're bringing in when we are making regulations or doing anything based on data that is outside? So my main question is, wouldn't we require more of a guideline? We have disclosure, something that we would want, but more of a guideline or a rule that says, okay, you are a private entity, you're using AI, you need to at least disclose the data, what kind of impact AI is having, for instance, Spotify. So yeah.
Yeah, Siddharth?
Thank you for the discussion, everyone. I had a question which maybe I thought both Eunice as well as the professors on the panel could maybe discuss, but I would love comments from the entire panel, which was Professor Rahul, you brought up the point about the size of the data labeling industry, and I think Professor Sudhir, you mentioned the point about where to kind of attack the value chain, where to kind of regulate on the value chain, or which part to regulate. And I thought I'd raise a question of like, do you feel that India has, seeing as the volume of data labeling work that happens in India, do you feel that, is it a missed boat of some kind, or is like what would be the ideal outcome for India as well as the larger Southeast Asian market as well, because there's a lot of data labeling that happens there as well. What is a good outcome, or what should have been a good outcome there? How do we look at this? That's all.
My question is very specific to IT industry because I'm from IT industry only. So yeah, right now, like we are reviewing NDAs on daily basis, right? And NDAs, we can see new AI clauses have been added by clients usually, that if you are using any AI technology or you are processing our data on any AI technology, please disclose that. And what I was thinking while reviewing these clauses was that if we agree to that and still we are using the AI technology, what will be the implication of not disclosing? Like if you have seen recently, the PwC case happened,
where the audit report got disclosed that it is AI generated, right? So the implication and the breach of data, that was more of my concern as in IT industry. So what can be the, if it is self-regulation is the key of this policy document, then how much pressing can be done for actually imposing certain penalty on these kind of things?
Yeah, thanks. Eunice, maybe you'd want to go first to respond. Hi, Eunice. Would you like to respond to the question directed at you on Southeast Asia and its approach, as well as on data labeling? Hello. Hi, Eunice. Can you hear me? Okay, maybe we've lost Eunice. Maybe Prakash, you can start with your final responses, and maybe I'll go through all of the members of the panel before ending with Amlan. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Just quickly on that last question that you asked, specifically on NDAs and disclosure of AI. I mean, you could look at it two ways, right? Nothing different, and as the report talks about, right? Nothing different in terms of essentially a misrepresentation. If you're saying you're using AI and you're making it a representation or a statement that you're not using AI, then straight up misrepresentation. Existing laws, contract laws, and tort laws, cover those areas. So nothing new and different or unique as to AI as it relates to that. Sort of having said that, goes back to the question, and as I think someone else also raised, about gathering information and data around what are the impacts of AI, what is the potential risk, and I think the paper also talks about that's a task that is one of the ones that they've recommended in the, I think, not short and medium term, that needs to be done, which is data collection on potential harms, right? But straight up, existing laws, as in many cases, already cover fairly straightforward things such as misrepresentation in terms of what you're saying you're doing, the tools that you use in providing a particular service.
Yeah, I think Eunice is back. So Eunice, any last responses?
Yeah, I understand from Amnon that there was a question about Southeast Asia AI regulation. So I think only with the exception of Vietnam, none of the Southeast Asian countries currently have horizontal binding AI regulation. So I think Thailand is in the process of thinking through, and Malaysia as well is going to put something forward by the end of this year. But I do think that based on conversations with the governments, they are not going to hew to the European approach. They are similarly sort of thinking through what works for them, and looking at different models, right? Japan, India, Korea, to figure out what makes sense for the economy. I think there was an earlier question about governance by assurance or governance by architecture in Asia. I would say that, it really, really depends on the natural philosophies that a lot of these governments have. I think Singapore is very market driven, and they do things, they make deliberate choices because they want to remain that hub. But I do think that in cases like China, it's not going to be the same approach. So it's going to be varied, I think, necessarily so, because of the different the divergences between the histories, the economic structures of these different economies. But I think one thing that it's worth, despite I think different governance approaches, I think one thing that it's worth working on and thinking through a lot more is sort of what are some common international baselines and standards that we can put in place to encourage some level of interoperability between the different markets.
Thanks a lot, Eunice. Jerry, do you have any last comments that you want? Professor Day, any last comments?
I'll just comment about the question about the labeling. Yeah, actually, I don't know the, the answer to it, but I'll just mention what problems it can create. You know, if you give these prompts like draw an image of a teacher in a classroom, most people know this, it will always draw a female teacher. Then if you say draw the image of a professor in a classroom, it will always draw a male. These are biases which have crept in. I've tried this with various professions, farmer, doctor, nurse, etc. These are labeling biases. This has come in partly because of the data you have accumulated on teachers in a classroom, and partly how they have been labeled. They're incorrect. Google had a very embarrassing situation where some students were called gorillas. That was clearly a labeling problem. Now, culturally, labeling is creating the echo chambers for you. You must be getting feed from various tools, whatever you read is the echo chambers are being created because somebody, and usually there's a person behind it, is labeling them in that manner. I think this is shaping what our consciousness, and I think that is serious. It is shaping what we understand as good. Oh, that was a great movie. It's shaping our thinking. We are influenced by these ratings and these sentiments that are coming in. Therefore, we need to take hold of this whole labeling industry. We need to have a say in this. If you ask me how, I don't know right now. But there are startups coming up who are going on and saying, take a picture in a street in Bangalore or in a rural area. We should label what those things are. That cart is not broken down. That's how it's functions. Those are the subtle differences which seep into these models, which begin to shape how we think about these issues. They should be by our design.
Professor Sundeep?
Yeah, thanks, Rahul. Just I don't think that the questions were to me, but I'll just try and summarize in some way some of the interventions from the audience in the room. Two things. I said something about the AI and value chain, but I think that and choosing a point of intervention. But I thought that the questions from the floor pointed us to a very different kind of strategy. Maybe the global south strategy on AI is not to talk about AI at all, but to just talk about competition law, or just to talk about ecology, you know, or to just talk about information regulation. We don't care what the AI system is doing, but we're very clear what our normative position on competition is. You don't have to take a Timbu Lina Khan version of competition law. You can have another version of competition law that suits the political economy concerns of the global south. This is an interesting way to think about the issue. It's not, it avoids the problem that I think Amlan and the paper is trying to avoid, which is that don't get into regulating technology in a technology specific way while the technology is still evolving, right? So you have two problems. You'll have obsolescence or you'll have a choking problem. You want to avoid both, and so don't take that tack at all, which I think is a fair argument in new technologies. But maybe the way to think about regulations, think about it in a completely different way, which is to talk about market structure and to talk about the ecological foundation or just how information flows. And we just focus on that. And if we get that right normatively, then if the engines are all built around those norms, we can't do too badly. Though we might want to also ask the question of value chain. I just want to say one thing about the argument about data labeling. And, it just reminds me of a very early debate in the 1990s when the IT industry was developing. And, I don't know, I guess many people in the room are too young for that, that there was this entire discourse about tech coolies. And I think that was obnoxious discourse in the 1990s. And I think that a lot of the literature I've read on data labeling, sorry, Rahul, has the same ring to it. I don't think that this is technically work. Uh, is it causing disproportionate harm to those who are data labelers? I don't think that it's like going into a nuclear power station and handling uranium rods. So I'm sorry, I just have very little sympathy for that position. It emerges from certain corners of the Western Academy about how this is horrible stuff and all that. I'll take a slightly more tempered view, that human in the loop kind of argument around labeling. Uh, at least I don't take a priori aversive view of the idea that somehow data labeling labor is per se wrong. I can't accept that kind of position, which I've seen some of the literature taking. Yeah. Amlan.
So thanks. I mean, I'm very conscious of time, keeping you from lunch. So I'm just going to do this in three parts, maybe try and do it in 3 minutes. The first is a series of questions on regulation, right? Maybe starting with the competition piece, Priti. So look, I don't think we've ignored the competition question. There are a few references to it. One, in the risk taxonomy, we say, systemic risks is a type of risk from AI. What does that mean? Market concentration, spillover effects, and so on, right? Two is the reason we didn't dive deep into that is at the time of the report, the CCI was doing its market study, hadn't published it, so we kind of deferred to them to at least see that. But I think there is a solution being offered. This merits a deeper discussion, but I think one way we were thinking potentially about it, and I think there is some merit to it, is to have more transparency on the value chain itself, right? Not in the value chain in terms of where is our comparative advantage geopolitically, but in the AI value chain, right? From the chips to the models to people fine-tuning it to the system integrators to the application developers. Right now, we and the competition regulators have no visibility on what's happening. A lot of it is determined by contracts, right? That Jaideep drafts very niftily, right? So, what's the revenue flow? What's the data flow? Where's the liability? What are the warranties representations made? Who's actually controlling? It's a power question, right? None of that is visible. So one way is perhaps a technology solution where people are, I think as was being suggested, you register, in bureaucracy generally averse to registration, but some way in which people, self-register or make themselves visible to the regulator so that it's obviously important to identify where the concentration lies, but perhaps especially in the Indian market, and I think we have the administrative, geopolitical power to be able to mandate this in some ways. Make yourself visible to the regulator, and we'll intervene when required, right? Or at least we'll know what's happening. And I think this will also be very useful for the liability question down the line, especially with agentic AI. Multiple agents. Who are they serving? What are they serving? Which organization in that enterprise value chain is actually responsible for that agent? I think having transparency on that chain is going to be really useful, and that's a technical solution, not a regulatory solution. This also points to, I think, this question about ex ante, this precautionary principle. I think the committee was very clear to say, it is a fact that the Indian government strategy is to prioritize innovation over restraint, or the way that it's defined is balanced innovation over cautionary restraint. And so I would argue that with that framing, having a precautionary principle is very difficult, right? My kind of view on that is the Indian government will never have a moratorium on AI development, for example, right? But are there rooms in certain areas where there is room for ex ante regulation? Yes, of course, right? Is competition an area in the AI value chain where there will be ex ante regulation? I think that's a discussion that's happening in the broader context of the digital economy as a whole. And that's not specific to AI. Is do we need ex ante competition regulation to address imbalances in the digital economy in India? We haven't answered that question yet, Shruti, as you know. So let's answer that, then we can pin down what we need to do on the AI context. Question on kind of sectoral versus federal, central regulation. I think the answer is both. You need to have sectoral regulation because if we are this use case focused AI economy, then the sectoral regulators are the closest to what's happening, right? The financial regulator will understand the financial use case, same for health and so on. So you need to have that sectoral regulation, but do you need central regulation? Yes, for the points like Jaideep mentioned, I mentioned on data, copyright, you can't have the Karnataka government regulating copyright differently from Andhra Pradesh. So on model transparency, on right to data portability and so on, you need central regulation. Short answer, both. The incident, like the data question, right? Yeah, absolutely. I think the point is very emphatically made. in the report. It's made in previous papers I've drafted. India needs a risk classification system developed based on India's local socio-cultural experience, and that needs to be based on empirical data collected on the ground, right? So the example I think that Yunus was making, do Indians care about AI-based surveillance as much as the Europeans do? No. Do we care more about caste-based discrimination from AI systems? Yes. Religious minority exclusion, so on? Yes. How are we going to inform that risk classification system? From data on the ground. One way to do that is an incident reporting database, which there is in the guidelines, like a deep discussion on that. There's academic literature coming out on what that looks like. Is it a centralized reporting system? Is it sectoral? Are enterprise companies like L&T required to mandate it to report those incidents happening? What granularity? All of those are open questions. But I think it's very clear. I did an interview with Economic Times, the headline of which is India needs an India-specific risk-based, empirical-based approach to risk for AI. Final question on this AI exceptionalism question, right? I think it's a very interesting one, which is AI is a general purpose technology. Is it like electricity? Maybe. Is it like nuclear bio? Maybe. But is it fundamentally different from other types of technology? Yes. And I did this presentation in Lithuania recently where I talked about 4-5 characteristics of AI, which I think make it so fundamentally different, right? One is, Professor Dev was saying, it's probabilistic, right? Which means the rule it isn't determined beforehand. Unintended consequences. We've never had a technology that's so powerful and so probabilistic where the developers themselves don't know how it will act. So do we need explainability? All of that? Yes. It's not some magical, crazy, but it's uniquely different from any other technology we've had, right? That behaves in these ways. Two is that it's generative. It creates things, right? In ways that, like we haven't seen before, right? And in multimodalities, and not just text, but audio, video, and so on, like in remarkable ways. Three is, I think, the fact that it's agentic. I mentioned, right? It's performing. It's performing autonomously with goal directedness coming from itself and influencing the environment. Again, haven't seen that. Nuclear. It has impacts on the world, but if it can act autonomously and impact the world, it's a very different type of technology. And finally, I think it's adaptive. It is contextual. All of that. These interesting characteristics. And finally, I think, which is probably the most dangerous, or depending on how you see it, is that they can be recursive self-improvement down the line. That it can 5 years from now, an advanced AI system will improve upon itself. And there is all of these loss of control risks and so on, and alignment risks that come from that. I don't think there is any technology we have seen that is able to kind of improve itself. And if we get there, we have to think about a completely new governance kind of thing. So there is this argument about there's no AI exceptionalism. All information regulation, all software regulation should be applied to AI. And yes, of course, that's the case. That's probably why you don't need a separate AI law. But if all of these characteristics play out in the way that I'm imagining them, or some people are imagining them, we definitely need a new governance regulatory kind of thing.
Thanks a lot, Amlan. I think this has been a great discussion, but we're well out of time. So thank you, all of you on the panel, and those of you who joined online, the audience in person. Thank you all for being very generous with your time on a weekend. Please have a good rest of the weekend. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rahul, for moderating.